Hello, everybody, and good day to you on this Thursday. I want to look at a psalm again today, and today I want to look at Psalm 23. So you could stop right now, just take a moment to read through that psalm. It's a psalm you're going to be very familiar with, and like I said, just stop the video at this point, and you can read through that. Now, some of the reasons why I chose to go through Psalm 23 is well, it is a very familiar psalm. Let's say that, and it's often used at graveside at the graveside service at a funeral. I've used it there. I think just about every time that I've done a funeral, it's used quite extensively, and the reason why is because even non-Christians are fully aware of this text. I mean, people all know that the Lord is my shepherd. I mean, it just rings true in our ears. We've heard that line before, so it has a connection to all people. So for that reason, but I think a lot of people are pulled towards it because of the last line where it says, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." We're going to talk about that idea forever. It is not talking forever like what we think of. In fact, it's a bad translation at that point. There's no idea forever in the Old Testament like what we're thinking. It's just not there, except maybe in relation to God. But even then, the people did not think that way. This is later development in thinking. Let's put it this way. You got to understand people can only understand things at a certain level of development in humanity. That kind of idea. So, in fact, in the Hebrew, it communicates this, and I'm going to come back to it, but it communicates the idea of length of days. That I will dwell in the house of the Lord a length of days. I will get to that verse, so let's just hold on for that just for a minute. Now, the translators, let me talk about translations real quick because we are going to be dealing with, I think there are 4 areas in this psalm, which it's not very long, it's only 6 verses. So 4 translation curiosities, let's say that, arise. And that's one of the reasons why I also want to look at this. This is one of the first psalms that I think I was in my second year of Hebrew studies. I was pretty far along as far as being able to utilize my Hebrew, basic Hebrew anyway. And this is one of the first assignments we had to do, and our instructor knew that there's lots of translation issues, several in this psalm. And so when we went through it, it was rather stunning, to say the least. Our translations just don't do a great job on this psalm. I'm going to tell you why. And it's like this in other places too. Our English translations are compiled by people who know, they're translated by people who really, really know the text very well. Now, it depends on different translation types. They have different committee practices, methodologies. Well, most of them practice the same type of translation methodology, which would be a sense for sense type of translation meaning, which would be the best. So I'm not arguing that. They do a very good job of translating the text for us. But by the time it gets to the editor of a publishing company, now publishing companies are not Christian. These are not Christian-based ministries. They're not at all. These are just publishing companies. They're just out to make money. And so they will edit it sometimes in order to make sales positive in their idea. Let me give you an example. So, I'll give you an example. Let me talk to you why they do that. The King James Version had such a dominant hold upon American Christianity for so long, 200 years, that when our newer translations started to come about, they differed. Not only in just language, removing of the thy and the thee, those kind of things. It was much more than that. The King James Version was based upon just a little bit around 100 manuscripts. They weren't the best manuscripts. There were lots of problems in the King James Version translation. It was the best they could do at that time, of course, and this is back in the 17th century, so a long time ago. But when our newer translations came out and they started to differ from the King James Version, they could see the sales of those Bible translations plummeting. So they rectified it. So let me give you an example. In the 1950s, a wonderful translation, in fact, most people still consider it to probably be the best translation ever produced. It was called the Revised Standard Version. And rightly so, they pulled out the story of the adulterous woman in John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:12. They pulled it out because it's not there. It shouldn't be included in our Bibles. They pulled out the part of Mark 16, 9 through 20. That last part of Mark should not be there. They removed it. Part of 1 John 5, verse 8 is another place where parts of it was removed. You look through Acts, our modern translations have several places where they skip a verse, and they should, because Acts, the King James Version, was using a manuscript of Acts that is actually I think it's 1/6 longer than what most scholars consider to be the actual reading of the text itself. So there's different manuscripts of Acts out there. Let's put it that way. They didn't have good access. The King James Version group did not have good access. So the Revised Standard Version comes along and they have better access to resources. We've got a lot more resources at that time to look at, and even more so today. So even today we're getting better translations all the time. They changed some of these things, and people who did not understand the original languages saw this as being that they were removing things from the Bible because it wasn't there in the RSV. It was there in the King James, but not in the RSV. And so sales plummeted. In fact, people were burning these Bibles, the RSV. Well, the publishers learned a lesson, not to veer very far away from the King James Version. So Psalm 23, it tries to, they keep it pretty anchored to the King James Version rendering. But I'm going to show you 4 places where there's some problems that come up. Now, in the Old Testament, I agree, it is harder to translate in the Old Testament. It's not nearly as precise as the New Testament, Greek, without a doubt. But what I'm bringing up are legitimate things that need to be addressed, and also for you to understand this so that you can have a better idea. And the last reason why I want to look at this Psalm 23, is because of the imagery of the Lord as a shepherd. And so this carries us right to John, Gospel of John, John chapter 10. There's a nice connection there that we can make about this. So let's open up Psalm 23 and talk about it for a few moments. So Psalm 23, I will identify it as a psalm of assurance. Seems to be giving a message of assurance. It could be praising God for his actions, and definitely could be that way, but it seems to be more of a message communicating assurance back to David. And let me talk about that for a second, just that the fact that this psalm is attributed to David. Not every psalm has an attribution, meaning there's no author attributed given at that for that psalm. Most, in fact, I can't think of any Old Testament scholar or Psalm scholar that would argue that the notification of an origin of that psalm, a psalm of David, or something to that effect is considered inspired, just for the fact that not every psalm has this kind of inscription. Now, having said that, looking at the Hebrew, I think it could be very well translated as a psalm by David, something to that effect. And so I think you could attribute this psalm to the pen of David, or he gave the information to someone who wrote these words. Could be that way. Could have been musical, we don't know. But I think a good argument could be made for this definitely being a psalm that came from either David's telling someone and they writing it down, or David writing it down himself. And another reason why is because of the message that's in it and knowing the life of David. So if you're studying the Psalms, I would urge you that you need to do a careful reading of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. You really need to know the life of David, and understanding his history will make it so much better and easier for you to possibly inject these Psalms into a time era. So anyway, this probably comes from David, and it does fit, I think, his relationship that he had with the Lord and the way he sought the Lord's guidance in his life in so many ways. So in verse 1, one other thing real quick about that imagery of shepherd. There are 4 dominant images for the Lord. Someone probably could come up with many more. 4 come up off the top of my head. I'm thinking about it. I had 3 down, and that 4th one just popped in. There are 4 images in the Old Testament that are given about God. So one, it comes from Genesis 1 and throughout the Psalms. It's God as an artist. So God has artistic abilities. We also have the idea in the Old Testament, thinking in Isaiah 36, 37, thinking about the Exodus event, that God is depicted as a warrior. So God can be depicted that way also in the Old Testament. He's often depicted as a shepherd. This is the one we're going to look at today. And he's often depicted as a husband to Israel. So these are dominant images that come out. And truthfully, honestly, the image of shepherd is the one that I admire the most and drawn to the most. And I think it's probably most appealing to you also. And I do think that it is the image that is talked about God, is related to God most often in these Psalms, but also, as I said, John chapter 10 is really, really important. All right, verse 1. So, the Lord is a shepherd to David. This is what it's talking about. So he says, my shepherd. It's for David. So David is the one that's telling the events here, relaying how he feels about this. And it is assurance for himself. You speak it to your heart. It's reassuring. It reassures you in that way. Again, this is David being inspired to relay this information, write this information, and then he's inspired by the Holy Spirit to do so, and he shares this for us. So there's something good for us here too. We could think of this same idea, and it, like I said, it carries over to John chapter 10 very, very well. But he goes on and basically says, I shall not want. And he's setting it up knowing that God is his provider, God is his protector, God is everything for him. So there is nothing in David's life that he lacks. And, that's something Christians really need to think about. I'm reading this book right now called The Freedom of Simplicity. And it's teaching the basic principle of contentment. And as I'm reading through it and I'm thinking about my life and other people's lives, seeing the absence of contentment sometimes is really, it's alarming to some degree, because I do think that Christians should have this idea of contentment. We should be thinking like the psalmist David says here, I have the Lord. He's my shepherd. There's nothing else that I need. There's nothing else that I want. That kind of idea. Being content with what we have. Well, verse 2 reminds us of God's provisions. I do find it interesting, and it is represented in Hebrew too, you can do this, that he causes the flock, I guess, and David is the sheep, flock, or part of a flock or something, but he makes this person, animal, let's keep it up, the shepherd and the shepherd makes the sheep lie down somewhere. So it's almost as if the sheep doesn't know what's best for him or her, but the shepherd does. So the shepherd provides. So David is even echoing that there are times in our lives that we just don't even know what to do, and we have to just lean on the Lord and understand that he will carry us through. He goes on, leading by these still waters, or quiet waters. It probably is not referring to like a pond or a lake, even though I guess you could say the Sea of Galilee would be a lake, but from my understanding about the Sea of Galilee, it has pretty steep cliffs on a lot of sides, so it's probably not the place that people are going to water their flocks, but they could. But it's probably more the idea of a moving stream. There's a bend somewhere in that stream, and on the backside of that bend somewhere there might be some calm waters. It's a place where the shepherd can take the sheep, and he doesn't have to worry about them falling in and being swept away by the currents. That's the idea. And so he's looking out for their safety. And so this is really, really helpful for us as we think about the Lord's care for David, but also it's there for us too. We're going to find that out in John chapter 10. In verse 3, here's where the first place where we have a translation problem. And so the word soul, I know it shows up in a lot of our translations. In fact, our modern translations too, but I'm telling you, it only shows up because of the King James influence. The word that's used in Hebrew, and the word is nephesh, it does not mean soul. It means like life-giving force or life essence. That's really what it means. In fact, technically, literally, that's what it became to be known as, but technically, it first it referred to the throat. The throat is air passing in and air passing out. And if a person can control the throat, then they can control that wind or that breath or that spirit So the word for spirit and breath in Hebrew is exactly the same in Greek too. They're the same, and so they saw this as we call it a choke point. That's what it is. I mean it, but it's not the idea of He restores my soul. It's He restores my living essence. It's like He's the one that gives me the jump in my step. He's the one who makes me want to get out of bed. That idea. So He does something. He infuses you somehow, energizes you. And that's exactly the way we should be thinking about the Lord. We need to depend upon the Lord so much more. Now He starts to turn in verse 3. We're leaving the shepherd and the sheep imagery and moving more towards just a regular relationship type of idea. But He leads me in the paths of righteousness, knowing that God is going to lead me not in the wayward ways, but God's going to lead me in the right ways, lead me to do the right things, be at the right places, that kind of idea, make the right choices, so forth and so on. And the reason why is, and this might sound odd to you, but this is the way the ancients would have thought, if they behaved, they acted inappropriately, misbehaved, then it could have a reflection on something, someone. And so in their mind, I still think it reflects today too. I'm not going to harp on it. The way we behave has a reflection upon God and His church. He's talking about that here, not the church, but He's talking about He wants to make sure that He lives in the right way so that He honors the Lord. We don't want to do anything that's going to shame the Lord, for sure. We already have with all our sin when He took it to the cross for us. Again, I'm moving back and forth between the New Testament and the Old Testament, but bear with me just for a second because it just carries over so easily. Okay? That we should have the same idea. I don't want to do things to offend or cause others to think offensively of God. In fact, there's a verse in 1 Peter, and it's 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, that says, and I'm paraphrasing, that basically the non-Christians, and I think it uses the word Gentiles there, but it means non-Christians. The non-Christians would see Christians doing their good works. That's what it says. Would see them doing their good works and would give glory to God on the day of His visitation. Meaning that I think it's talking about the day of His return or something to that effect. But the point is that our good behaviors can have a great reflection upon God, and conversely, our inappropriate behaviors can be very, very shameful. Verse 4, we have another place where it's a translation issue. It's not the idea of walking through the shadow of death. It's the idea of walking through the shadow of gloom or darkness. Now, I know why they translate this as death. I know why King James Version did, I'm pretty sure. But it shouldn't be translated this way. It should just be the idea of darkness or gloom. And the idea is the way the ancient people thought of a place called Sheol. They didn't have any idea of heaven or hell in the Old Testament. It was just Sheol. Sheol is just the grave. And in this area, this abode, they depicted it as being a foggy existence where people kind of just moved around, but they didn't really have purpose. They didn't have any meaning to their existence, and they were shadowy figures. It's really, really odd. And so, but here he's not necessarily talking about death. He's just talking about, like, even though I'm in a shadow that's dark or in the valley of some darkness or gloom or something like that, I don't have any fear because the Lord is with him. That's what he says. He talks about evil. So we're talking this place of evil. So it's not necessarily a place of death. It's a place where there's, darkness, chaos, that kind of idea. And in these places, I'll feel no evil because God is with him. Then he goes on, your rod and your staff. They're probably really talking about two ideas here, or one idea, and it could be labeled with these two, but whatever. It's not a big deal. Just like the shepherd has the staff, now he's kind of moving back to that idea. As the shepherd has the staff, well, there's comfort there also that shepherd has this in order to protect. It provides David this comforting feeling. So now in verse 5, we start to see why this is so good for him. Actually, what we got in verse 5 is an idea of blessing. So if a person was sitting down at a table to eat, it's an idea of being blessed. Someone is blessing you with food. And it's like God. He's the one that's preparing the table. So God is preparing this table for David, is the image that you get here. And then also in that image is that his enemies are looking at him as this is going on. And they're seeing in the image the Lord serving David. What an honor. What a blessing. And so it shames his enemies, because enemies who've said that David is not doing the right thing, that David is not walking with the Lord, or something to that effect, those who oppose David, are shamed and shown that they are wrong by the Lord's actions here. Now, here's another translation problem. It's not anoint. It should never been translated as anoint. This is not the idea. The word for anoint in Hebrew is actually the word we use Messiah. We get Messiah from. So this is not the idea here. But here is what is going on. It does talk about pouring oil on someone, or dripping oil on someone, that effect. So let me give you kind of the background here. So Palestine is really a kind of a semi-arid place. So it's more dry than it is wet. And they're walking around all the time. And they're out in the elements, and it's probably windy a lot. And so their hair gets tangled. Their skin gets cracked. Oil was, in one way, to help them to get the tangles out of their hair, and also to soothe those dry spots or cracks. And so it's an example of hospitality. This is what you do when you're a good host, showing this hospitality. You prepare the table for a feast, and you give your guest this ointment to help them for personal hygiene. And here's the thing. They didn't waste any oil. You got to understand, it wasn't one done and it's over. They would have saved that oil. That oil could be used for lamps in their where they lived at. They would have used that to burn for lamps. So they would not waste it. And so, but the person who's preparing or pouring the oil doesn't care about being generous with it either, because it's so the flow is so much that it goes down into a cup that catches, but it's so much that's being used that it overflows, that kind of idea. So the blessing is just overflowing. It's an abundance of blessing is what he's trying to say. And so it's that God is like the host with the mostest, that kind of idea. Sorry, the host with the most, I think is what they say. Then in verse 6, we also have our last translation problem. But the first part's not a problem. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Absolutely. And that's exactly what he's talking about here. In fact, he actually talks about his steadfast love. It's hesed is what's used here. And that's probably, if you look at different translations, it may say steadfast love here instead of mercy. But the idea of hesed is a tremendous Hebrew word. It has so many positive connotations. Mercy is one of those, but it also has the idea of devoted love. It also has the idea of grace within it. So it's a pretty profound word. But that is going with him all the days of his life. All the days of his life. Now, the idea of the next part is where we have our problem, as I said before. There is not an idea, in fact, it shouldn't be translated as forever. Should have never been done that way. That's kind of got us in the wrong track. What it really just says is for a length of days. And it's idiomatic. It definitely is. And it's not about dwelling in the house, even though, I mean, the word is, but it's like setting. You could translate this as setting in the house. And the house of the Lord is the temple. It's not the church, or it's not heaven. So he's talking about going to the temple to worship the Lord all the days of his life, is what he's talking about. And so it's almost as if it's a result of all the goodness that God has put into his life, that he wants to return his praise back in a way to show his gratitude for that. So, all right. Let me talk about John chapter 10 real quick and kind of close this up. This is where the image carries over into the New Testament. In fact, that's what I'll try to do so many times when we look at these Psalms, is show you how these are instrumental within our new covenant, or teaching about the Lord, or the Lord's teaching, or something to that effect. Well, the idea of a shepherd carries over into John 10. I urge you to read John chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. I think that pretty well covers the whole section. It's just a great discourse where Jesus says this idea about him being the shepherd. He says he's the good shepherd. And so we do have this shepherd in our life as Christians, as Jesus is our shepherd. In fact, in 1 Peter 5, as Peter's closing out his letter, he talks about Jesus as being the chief shepherd. So he is the best. He's the most prominent we have. So he is our shepherd in John chapter 10. He protects us from dangers. We just need to let him be our shepherd. So many times we are the ones who are reluctant to let the Lord do what it is he needs to do in our lives. We have got to trust in the Lord. So let him be our shepherd, and he will protect us from the dangers. He goes in that passage, he talks about his willingness to sacrifice himself for his flock. Now, as John continues on, he will continue to expand upon this idea and expound upon what he's trying to implement here. But the point is he's moving to the cross. And so he's giving some preliminary clues that where he's headed with this and where it's going. And so he is willing to lay down his life for his flock. And it also says that he can take up his life too. So it's interesting how it has this forecasting to the resurrection. Even the disciples do not know what he's talking about. And it would be interesting. I always thought it would be interesting if we could remove that information from our heads and kind of start afresh with each gospel. When we get to John chapter 10 and we read this, we'd probably bypass right through it too and not think much of it. But as things start to unfold in the Gospel of John, and we start to see what's going to happen, we can think back and yeah, Jesus did talk about that. Where? Back in chapter 10. I remember now. Now I start to see how he is forecasting this and how it's unfolding in real time, in a sense. He truly loves his flock. His flock is his church. He truly, truly loves his church. He is the protector, the shepherd of the church. We need nothing else. And so we need to really lean on and depend upon him. He is our good shepherd. That's what he says. Another thing about the shepherd imagery, and he brings this up, is that he says that he's the gate too. There's no one that comes in except through him, that kind of idea. And so we think about salvation. There is no other way for us to have salvation except through Jesus. This John chapter 10 imagery of Jesus as a shepherd is just so meaningful, and I urge you, take some time and reflect upon that. And Jesus also says in that passage that he calls his people to him, and he will be their shepherd for the flock. And so we need to trust in Jesus. Trust in him for our salvation. Trust in him for our livelihood. Trust in him for our everything. Okay, that's all I have today. Next week we'll look at another psalm. I hope you found this to be interesting, and I hope you have a blessed week. Take care. Bye.